You hear the buzz about responsive feeding, but do you really know what it is and how to use it to your child's advantage?
Welcome to the Nourish Child Podcast, a show about childhood nutrition, feeding kids, and dealing with the ups and downs of growing a healthy child. Here's your host, registered dietitian and childhood nutrition expert, Jill Castle.
Hey there, Jill here. Welcome to the Nourish Child Podcast. I'm hoping you were able to listen to the last episode. I had the dad dietitian, Desi Abeda, come on the show to talk about how dads can help mold their children's healthy eating habits. Really good show. I hope you encourage the dads in your life to listen in. There's a lot going on in my personal life right now. We are moving states and moving into some downsized living situations. So this show today is going to be on the briefer side because I have painters downstairs and movers in my house. So hopefully you won't hear any of them. I did have a really nice email from a listener this week by the name of Heidi, and she says, "Thank you, Jill. Your podcast carried me through my tired time driving in the car. It beats a cup of coffee." Well, I'll tell you, that makes me happy because I know how important coffee is. It's very important to me, and I'm happy to hear that my podcast is equally, if not more important than a cup of coffee, which is great. I've also gotten a lot of emails from listeners and followers of the blog about ARFID, Avoidant Restrictive Food Intake Disorder. And I just want to let you know, if you have not heard back from me, it's not because I'm ignoring you. It's really because my life is a little bit hectic right now on the personal side, but also I want to reassure you that I am working on an ARFID guide, which I am hoping to publish on thenourishchild.com in the next month or two. And it's not going to be a guide that goes through all the different diagnostic procedures and treatment procedures and all of that stuff. I already have a book out called Try New Food, How to Help Picky Eaters Taste, Eat, and Like New Foods. And in that book, I do cover how to interact and help the child who has more of an extreme picky eating profile learn how to taste new foods. So I'm not going to recreate the wheel and do that. This ARFID guide will really be answering the question that I get all the time, which is, I think my child has ARFID. Now what do I do? So that's what the ARFID guide is going to be about. I'm going to help you understand who can help, hopefully give you some resources to investigate so that you can look for more help. So look for that on thenourishchild.com. It'll be a PDF download. It won't be a printed book. It'll be something that you can download onto your computer and print out. Okay, so we are talking about responsive feeding today. And I think for the most part, we can all be responsive with feeding throughout childhood, no matter what age your child is. But when we talk about responsive feeding, this term is really used most often when we're talking about babies. So what is responsive feeding? Responsive feeding is an attentive way of feeding very young children, babies, and it involves watching for their hunger cues and responding to them by offering food. We use appetite cues to really guide responsiveness. And in that, responsive feeding also pays attention to a child's fullness cues. And being responsive means that when you see that your baby is showing signs of fullness, you end the meal and you stop feeding him. So that's really responsive feeding. It's a two-way relationship between the parent and the child. The parent is always kind of closely watching for those appetite cues and signals from their babies and responding to them appropriately. So obviously, if you want to be good at responsive feeding, you really do need to monitor your child's hunger and fullness by learning these cues in your own child, because they will differ from child to child. So let's talk about how kids show their appetite signs or their appetite signals, depending on the age of your child. And I'll go up through teenagerhood in this as well. But there are easy signs to recognize. And what I think is important to note, and we've talked about this on the show before, is that as your child gets older, the appetite cues can get muddled. We can have things like head hunger versus tummy hunger or physical hunger. And that can be a little bit confusing for the child, but it can also be very confusing to parent. But if we're talking about babies show telltale signs of hunger and fullness, but they're not language-based cues. So, for example, they might wiggle or cry out or appear uncomfortable. And as a parent, you have to determine, is that hunger, or do they have a wet diaper? Are they tired? It could be a range of things. So that's why it's really important to pay close attention over time so that you start to recognize your own child's appetite cues. Babies can root for the breast or the bottle. That's another common sign of hunger in babies. Toddlers can tell you when they're hungry and when they're full because they have emerging language skills, and some toddlers can even sign hunger and fullness. During toddlerhood, it's really important to start that conversation of helping your toddler be able to communicate hunger and fullness. So when my kids were little, I used to say, "Is your belly happy?" which would mean it's satisfied. Or I'd say, "Is your belly hungry?" And we would just constantly have these conversations, peppered in throughout the day when appropriate, not in a overbearing way by any means. But I wanted my toddlers to be able to start to understand the difference between feeling hungry and feeling satisfied. And I wanted them to be able to have the language to express that feeling to me. So that's where I came up with, "Is your belly happy?" or "Is it hungry?" And my kids, I'm not saying all kids would be able to navigate that terminology, but my kids certainly could. Now, as I mentioned, older children can verbalize hunger and fullness too, but they might confuse their emotions or boredom with true hunger. So again, what is the whole point of paying attention to your child's appetite cues? Well, it can help you avoid overfeeding them or even underfeeding them. So you might be wondering how responsive feeding actually helps children. So when you respond appropriately and promptly to your baby's appetite signs, you're basically showing her warmth, love, and support. And you know that a baby's first social, emotional, developmental milestone is to develop attachment. That's sort of their social, emotional skill they need to learn in the first years of life. And so feeding your baby promptly when they're hungry and accurately, being responsive to those appetite cues, shows her that warmth, love, and support, and helps your baby develop his or her social and emotional health, helping her know that she can count on you to meet her needs when she needs them. And this establishes basically a foundation of trust. And that foundation of trust lends to a solid attachment in that infancy stage. And honestly, I believe, and many people believe, it is the trust foundation that's the most important aspect of the parent-child relationship at this young age. And granted, it's not just all about feeding. It's like if your baby has a wet diaper and you ignore your baby for 4 hours and don't change that wet diaper, that erodes the trust foundation. So it's being responsive in all areas. But because we are talking nutrition and feeding, I'm highlighting how to be establishing that trust foundation through responsive feeding in infancy. Also, when you respect your toddler's fullness, you honor and sustain that natural-born appetite regulator in his body. So you preserve, in other words, you preserve his native ability to recognize that he's full, and you support this by stopping the feeding session. We talked a lot about this in episode number 46 with Leslie Schilling. We talked about baby's intuition and how that informs their eating. It's such an important thing, and I encourage you to go back and listen to that episode if you want to learn more about it. She also is the co-author of Born to Eat, so she talks about her book there as well, which is a great resource. Now, if you are feeding an older child and you question your older child's hunger, maybe you're questioning it because she just ate lunch and now she's telling you she's hungry and it's only been less than an hour. You're helping her tune into her appetite and begin to identify hunger as a primary reason for eating. Now, we eat for lots of different reasons. We eat for hunger. That's our homeostatic reason for eating. We eat for pleasure, which is our hedonic reason for eating. And we can also eat for executive functioning reasons. So that's sort of an older, more mature skill. Like adults use executive functioning a lot to make decisions around eating. Teenagers can do the same. As you get to that younger child, those executive functioning skills may not be there yet to make those decisions. And so children really do tend to decide to eat based on actual true hunger or for hedonic reasons, pleasure, or sometimes they learn to eat in the absence of hunger. There's a lot of research on children and this concept of eating in the absence of hunger. And so again, this is more about emotional eating or eating for boredom, celebration, sadness, disappointment. So all of those emotions that can trigger that desire to eat and can muddle up the physical hunger cues that we want our kids to stay tuned into. So if you want to learn more about the science of emotions and eating, tune or scroll back to episode number 86, where I talked to Melanie Smith about that. She's from the Renfrew Center. It was a great episode, one of my favorite personal episodes. And then also episode number 26, where I interviewed Marianne Jacobson about how to raise a mindful eater. So as you know, and you probably, if you have older kids, you recognize this, it gets more difficult to navigate eating with children and their hunger and fullness cues because there's more going on than just pure physical hunger and pure pleasure. There can be other things happening, like emotions that tell them that they want to eat when there might not be the physical signs of hunger there to support that. So responsive feeding, getting back to responsive feeding, it sets the stage for helping your child sustain and regulate her appetite. And it really does begin, this whole process begins with recognizing hunger and fullness in your baby. So let's go through what some of the signs of hunger in infants would be. So number one, your baby fusses or cries. Now, I alluded to this earlier. Fussing or crying doesn't always mean hunger. It can mean other things like discomfort or fatigue or even boredom. So you'll want to tease that out and really watch your baby. Babies do get into a rhythm and a pattern with their cues and their signs, even though they can't tell you with their words. Another sign of hunger might be that your baby is smiling, gazing, or cooing at you during a feeding. This means your baby's enjoying her food and she wants to continue eating. A third sign of hunger might be that your baby moves her head toward the spoon or the bottle or roots for your breast. This is just a clear sign your baby wants to eat. If your baby is a little bit older, she or he might reach for or point to food. This is because her emerging ability to communicate with language or signs is getting clearer, and she's learned that these things like pointing can incur reception of food. Now, pointing might not mean hunger. She might just see a food that she likes and wants to eat it, even though she just ate. But pointing or reaching for food gives you the indication that your baby's learning to connect food with her appetite and eating, which is a good thing. She's learning. Your baby might show excitement when food is offered. And again, this is your baby responding to food. And this might be a sign that she's ready to eat. And then at the end of infancy, it gets easier to read your baby's hunger cues because she can start to communicate in multiple ways. She might use sounds, her words, or actually use sign language if you teach her that to indicate hunger. This episode is brought to you by The Nourish Child, the ultimate nutrition school for parents who want to raise good eaters. Kids change a lot. Their nutrition needs, eating habits, and food preferences do too. So much so, it can be hard to keep up. The Nourish Child helps parents get crystal clear on raising healthy kids who are good eaters. We've cracked the code on nourishing the whole child, whether you're raising a baby, a teen, or a child with health concerns. You'll find free resources, guides, tutorials, and programs to help you get the inside scoop on food and nutrients, positive food parenting, and building self-motivated, autonomous kids who enjoy all foods. The Nourish Child builds you up with nutrition and feeding know-how so you can confidently raise a healthy, happy child. Visit thenourishchild.com today. Okay, so if we've just reviewed your baby's hunger cues, what are baby's fullness cues? So let's kind of walk through these a little bit. Your baby decides that he's going to decrease his rate of sucking or stops sucking altogether. So slowing the rate of eating is a sign that fullness is closing in. So you don't want to force the rest of the bottle because this can overfeed your baby. Another sign is that your baby spits out the nipple. This is a clear sign of being full and done with eating. Don't try to ease that nipple back into your baby's mouth to finish off the last ounce or two of the bottle. Your baby is showing you a clear sign of being done when he spits out the nipple. Another sign is that your baby becomes really easily distracted or pays more attention to the environment around him rather than the bottle or the breast or the solid food that he's eating. So generally, young children will eat pretty vigorously when they're hungry, and they'll consume a greater percentage of calories early in the meal. So it's important to really minimize those distractions at feeding sessions so that you are able to read your baby's appetite cues and your baby can really focus on eating, because that early stage of feeding a meal is when the lion's share of the nutrition will be ingested. Another sign is that your baby moves his head away from food. So, when your baby's older and eating solids, dodging the spoon or slouching away from food in the high chair can be a sign of fullness. Also, as I mentioned with nursing or bottle feeding, the same happens if your baby is eating solid foods when he slows the pace of his eating. So when a baby is approaching fullness, he will slow down the rate of his food consumption. And again, these might feel so obvious to you, but in my experience as a practicing pediatric dietitian and a mom of 4 kids, when you can really tune into these signs of appetite and signs of hunger and signs of fullness, you are better equipped and able to be responsive, to respond appropriately. So we also know as your baby gets older and becomes, an old baby, if you will, or a very young toddler, it becomes a lot easier to recognize fullness. Your baby might bat at the spoon, turn her head away, clench her mouth shut, shake her head no, play with food, throw it, or just tell you nope or all done. Those are clear signs to stop the meal or the snack, stop the feeding session. So that's what we're really talking about when we're talking about responsive feeding. So let's explore what the opposite of responsive feeding is, which is non-responsive feeding. And unfortunately, non-responsive feeding can be a thing. So I remember about 10 years ago, back in 2011, I was just starting my speaking career, and I had my first big speaking engagement, and I showed a picture of a baby sitting in a bouncer seat with a bottle in his mouth, propped up by towels, and he was all alone. And so the bottle was propped so he could continue to drink it, but there was no human there. He was sitting alone in this bouncy seat. And, the bottle was surrounded by rolled towels, and this was all in an effort to prevent the bottle from rolling out of the baby's mouth. And when I showed that picture and I said, this is an example of non-responsive feeding, there were gasps in the audience. And then I showed a picture of a toddler sitting in a high chair all by himself while the mom was across the kitchen on the telephone. And there were heads in the audience shaking back and forth and tongues tisk-tisking. So non-responsive feeding is unfortunately pretty common. It's when, you have your baby in the high chair and you take off to go switch the laundry and your baby is, for the most part, alone, feeding himself. Yes, that might be the most convenient way to get your laundry done, but it is not the most effective way to take advantage of how positive that responsive feeding can be in your child's life. So non-responsive feeding can occur in two ways. Number one, you're not around or engaged with your baby or child during feeding. Or two, you're ignoring his or her appetite signs. It doesn't really matter whether you're on the phone or doing laundry or washing dishes. The point is, when it's time to feed your child, it's really time to engage with your child, not disengage. So in the case of ignoring appetite signs, one of the ways I said that you can be non-responsive in your feeding, I see this a lot in the toddler years especially. Parents might ignore their child's fullness. They might decide that their child has not eaten enough, and so they push the spoon into their baby's mouth to get him to finish the contents of the baby food jar. Or they nudge that bottle into the baby's mouth to make sure that last ounce is polished off. These two examples really showcase pushing a baby beyond his appetite to eat more food. On the opposite side, being non-responsive might be that you're not responding to your baby or your child's hunger when he's showing those signs. And it might stem from the fact that meals and snacks aren't really scheduled out in a manner that supports your child's appetite. And in some families, there is no schedule for meals and snacks. It's kind of whenever the child is hungry. And I guess you could argue that that could be an effective way to feed your child, just to wait until he's hungry. I actually don't agree with that. I feel like a structure and a schedule for children provide those opportunities for them to eat and avoids them becoming overly hungry. Because when we get overly hungry, we tend to overly eat as a response. And we don't really want to teach and train our children to eat that way. We want them to be aware of their appetite. We want them to have opportunities on a regular basis to eat if they are hungry. But we also want to honor the fact that just because we provide an opportunity for them to eat, that doesn't mean they have to eat. We need to be okay with them not eating during an opportunity. So when parents are, not responding to their child's hunger, when they are maybe even saying, you just ate, there's no way you could be hungry, we don't eat until another 4 hours. You can stretch your child too long with those eating schedules. This can lead a child to feel desperate to eat and, as I mentioned, overeat because they've lost control of their eating. So there's this sweet spot of setting up an eating schedule and a structure around meals and snacks that really supports children in their appetite regulation. And again, I've talked about this before and I've written a lot about it. It's in my course, The Nourish Child Blueprint. But each age and stage of childhood has sort of a different windows of time that we want to target meals and snacks. When those are irregular, when they're spaced out too far, children can get desperate about eating, get more focused and preoccupied with eating. They can also undereat. They can be underfed when that's happening as well. Scheduling things too close or being hyper responsive just because your child says they're hungry and not taking the time to tease out whether that's really a physiological situation or it's a cognitive, I think I'm hungry, I'm bored, I'm sad, there's nothing to do. You, as a parent, have to really tease that out. And so it is a little bit of a dance in terms of frequency of meals and snacks. And there's a lot more that goes into it, obviously. The type of food that you're offering at meals and snacks have a big role in how satisfied your child is at the end of a meal or snack as well. So what does the research say about non-responsive feeding? Most of the research indicates that when appetite signs aren't responded to appropriately, you run the risk of overriding your child's ability to regulate his appetite. So we don't want to do that. We want our kids to really be masters at their own appetite. And we want to trust that they know how to manage their appetite. So just to take you through an example, let's say your baby's done eating. He pulls off the bottle, turns his face away from it, but there's 2 ounces left. You really want him to finish it. So you put the bottle back in his mouth and encourage him to drink it. So you might be thinking, what's wrong with 2 more ounces? Well, when you push your baby to finish the bottle or the baby jar of food or the plate full of dinner, you are overriding that internal barometer that tells your child when he's satisfied and done eating. This is the barometer that regulates your child's appetite. In other words, you're ignoring his full factor. Okay? Repeatedly encouraging more food intake beyond fullness while you might be ignoring these signs. This is literally training your baby to overeat or your child to overeat. This non-responsiveness with feeding can be something that does train your baby to eat more food than he needs. Other research tells us that children who aren't fed in a responsive manner are maybe at higher risk for unhealthy weight gain. So when children aren't good at regulating their appetite, they can overeat, they can undereat, they can eat as an emotional response, and they can misinterpret their own hunger cues. So we want to be responsive, obviously. And so here's just some really quick tips for being responsive feeders. Number 1, if you're feeding your child, look at him when you're feeding him, especially your baby, your toddler. Get there face to face and make feeding an interaction. Look for those subtle signs. Get familiar with your baby. Figure out his signs as he's growing. Maybe you have a crier or a rooter, or maybe you have a baby who flails her arms when she's hungry. Try to connect your baby's patterns of actions and behaviors to patterns of hunger and fullness. The third tip is obviously feed your child when there are true hunger signs present. And again, you're going to probably, as your child gets older, you're going to have to tease those out a little bit more and really see if it's physical hunger or something else going on. But you are able to do that because you know what you've fed your child throughout the day. And that is my 5th tip, which is to monitor your child's eating. And monitoring simply means you know what's going on with your kids' eating. You know what they've eaten throughout the day. You know how much, how frequently. This knowledge and information increases your ability to stay responsive, attentive, and appropriately reactive through feeding. The more aware you are of how well and what your child's eating throughout the day, the better equipped you are to respond to pleas of, I'm hungry or I'm full. And then the last tip is when your child is full, stop feeding him. You need to have the faith that your child knows how much to eat and when to stop eating. All children are born with this sense of appetite regulation. They are born being able to regulate their appetite. It oftentimes is our parenting response that can mess things up. So that's why you want to be masters at responsive feeding. The other thing that I hope will temper any concerns you have about your child being able to regulate his appetite is that we set up a structure with meals and snacks. There's more than one meal a day, more than one snack a day for the most part for young children. There's multiple opportunities for your child to eat. So those opportunities should be adequate to close any gaps, any skipped meals, skipped snacking that happens along the way. And also remember, you have a whole week. If your child doesn't have a good day of eating, you've got the next day. We're looking at averages over time. We're not looking at perfection on one day. So that's it, folks. I hope that you found this to be a helpful episode. If you do have a baby, you'll want to be uber attentive to your child's hunger and fullness signs and respond appropriately. But you can be responsive all along childhood. Remember, the terminology responsive feeding really does sort of hone into that infancy stage. The terminology changes as children get older to feeding styles and food parenting. Those are kind of the terminology we're starting to use in the older childhood segment. Both of these topics I've discussed on this show before. You can go back to episode number 100 and episode number 3, one of the very first ones. Just go to thenourishchild.com/100 for episode number 100 and /003 for episode number 3. Be sure to check out all the episodes I've mentioned in this show, and don't forget to check out my YouTube channel for more tips and useful feeding information. You can find everything I discussed today in the show notes over at thenourishchild.com/133. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Nourished Child. Now here's what I want you to do next. If you haven't grabbed my free checklist, How to Nourish a Child, head over to www.thenourishchild.com and click on the show notes for this episode. This checklist is designed to give you a clear path and the steps you need to take to raise a nourished child inside and out. Also, if you love the show, I'd love for you to rate and leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Not only will this give the nourished child a boost, it will also help other parents find it. Now, let's wrap this up. I'm Jill Castle, and until next time, give that child in your life a loving squeeze today. Bye for now.
Thanks for listening to the Nourished Child podcast, where the #1 goal is to help you grow a nourished child inside and out.